Most people think they understand air combat in 1965. Jets kill prop planes, speed wins, technology decides. That belief falls apart the moment you stand in front of a gray-green A-1 Skyraider in the National Naval Aviation Museum and look at a single red star painted beneath the canopy rail. The museum catalog calls it an air-to-air victory marking. Technically accurate, historically absurd. The aircraft is Bureau Number 5, 2-1, 32646. It was never designed to fight jets. It was built to carry punishment, not chase it. Yet on June 20th, 1965, it shot down a MiG-17. And the strangest part isn't that it happened. It's how the decision was made in the seconds before it did. That's where this story begins. The Douglas A-1 Skyraider was an attack aircraft in the purest sense of the word. One Wright R3350 radial engine producing roughly 2,700 horsepower. 4 20mm cannons in the wings. A payload capacity of up to 8,000 pounds. More external ordnance than a B-17 carried internally in World War II. It could loiter for hours over a target, provide close air support, escort search and rescue helicopters, or hunt trucks along jungle roads. What it could not do, on paper, was fight a jet. Maximum level speed, about 318 miles per hour at optimal altitude. The MiG-17 it faced could exceed 700. In climb rate, acceleration, and top speed, the Soviet-designed fighter outclassed the Skyraider in every measurable category. Doctrine reflected that reality. North Vietnamese pilots were trained to engage American fighters, F-4 Phantoms, F-8 Crusaders, not slow, prop-driven attack planes. MiGs did not hunt Skyraiders. There was no reason to. That morning, Lieutenant, junior grade, Clinton Johnson, launched from USS Midway in Bureau Number 52-132646 on what should have been a routine road interdiction mission. His wingman, Lieutenant, junior grade, Charles Hartman, flew another A-1H. Both aircraft were loaded for ground attack. The air tasking order did not emphasize MiG activity in their sector. The expectation was simple. Find trucks, destroy trucks, return to the carrier. Standard procedure in 1965. The North Vietnamese were still calibrating their response to American air power. Engagement patterns were evolving. Assumptions were still being tested. At approximately 1547 local time, those assumptions collided. Hartman spotted them first, 4 MiG-17s approaching from the 7 o'clock high position. Closing fast, radio call. The geometry shifted from mission profile to survival in seconds. Here is where the physics become uncomfortable. A MiG diving with excess energy holds every advantage. It chooses the terms of engagement. It dictates vertical separation. It can fire, extend, and reset. A Skyraider caught low and slow should evade, descend to terrain masking, or call for fighter cover. That would be the rational play. Johnson did not choose the rational play, he turned into them. From a historian's perspective, that decision is the fulcrum. Turn away and you concede initiative. Turn into and you compress the engagement window. A high-speed attacker risks overshooting if the target tightens its turn radius at the correct moment. The Skyraider, heavy but stable, could sustain tight, low-speed turns that a faster jet might misjudge during a diving pass. It was not elegant. It was not doctrinal, but it was possible. 12 seconds before the first rounds left his cannons, Johnson committed to a descending left turn, pulling approximately 4 Gs. The lead MiG pilot, likely expecting the Skyraider to flee or break low for terrain, continued his attack geometry. Speed became liability. Closure rate increased. Turn radius widened. Overshoot began. At 15:47:22, according to the gun camera timestamp, Johnson fired 4 20mm cannons, converging fire, short-controlled burst. The footage exists in Navy archives. Stills confirm impact. The MiG-17 crossed through the Skyraider's gun sight at the one moment when relative motion favored the slower aircraft. Energy management, not raw speed, decided the outcome. The MiG descended trailing smoke. He didn't dive for the deck. He didn't call for help. He didn't panic and run. Johnson did the one thing the MiG pilot's math did not allow for. He turned into the attack geometry and tightened the circle until physics began charging interest. At roughly 310 knots indicated in a hard, disciplined turn, the A-1H could hold about 4 Gs without hemorrhaging energy. It was built heavy, stable, honest, in a sustained fight. The MiG-17, coming in closer to 450 knots, carried speed as an asset, until it became a liability. To match the Skyraider's tightening radius, the MiG would have to dump energy or pull Gs flirting with blackout. Different machines, different problems. At 15:47:05, 17 seconds before Johnson squeezed the trigger, the lead MiG committed to a classic gun pass from Johnson's 5 o'clock. Fast approach, quick burst, extend away on superior thrust. The setup assumed predictability, straight and level, or a shallow break away from the threat. Instead, Johnson turned into him. That single reversal inverted the geometry. At 15:47:08, the MiG flashed past the Skyraider's canopy. Close enough, Johnson would later say, to see the pilot's helmet. An overshoot measured in heartbeats. For perhaps 3 seconds, the faster aircraft became the target. Johnson rolled wings level just long enough to stabilize the sight picture, pulled the necessary lead, and fired. 4 20mm cannons spoke at once. The MiG-17's Klimov VK-1 engine could produce nearly 6,000 pounds of thrust. It could not tolerate high-explosive incendiary rounds in its combustion section. Engines rarely explode in cinematic fireballs when hit. They fail. Turbine blades shed, compressors seize, thrust collapses to zero. A jet without thrust is not dramatic. It is simply a glider with poor manners. The still frames from the gun camera show smoke, not flame. A descending arc toward jungle southwest of Thanh Hoa. No visible explosion. The Navy report confirms the kill. It does not confirm the pilot's fate. Some facts are archived. Others dissolve between paperwork and the lived reality of the men involved. The remaining 3 MiGs broke off immediately. No attempt to press Hartman. No second pass on Johnson. They left. That decision fits a broader pattern in 1965 to 66. Aircraft preservation mattered. Trading a MiG for nothing was unacceptable. Trading one to a prop-driven attack plane was worse. Doctrine adjusted quickly in North Vietnam. Skyraiders would rarely be engaged again once the lesson set in. Johnson and Hartman returned to the USS Midway. Johnson landed with most of his bombs still hanging beneath the wings. He had fought a jet with guns only. That night, a single red star appeared under the canopy rail of Bureau Number 5, 2-1-3-2-646. The airplane would fly 72 more missions before Midway rotated home. At Korat, jet crews called the A-1 the Spad, not kindly. The nickname borrowed from World War I fighters. Fabric, wires, obsolescence the moment cleaner aerodynamics arrived. To call the Skyraider a Spad was to imply it belonged behind velvet ropes. On paper, the insult made sense. Designed in 1944 by Douglas as a single-seat carrier attack bomber for the Pacific War, it emphasized payload and endurance over glamour. Massive external stores. 6 hours of loiter on internal fuel. It could haul more ordnance than a B-17 carried inside its fuselage, and still feel unhurried over a target. It was slower than some helicopters in a steep dive. It was never meant to chase anything, but that is precisely why the geometry worked. The MiG assumed speed dictated control. Johnson understood that turning radius and timing could briefly outweigh thrust. The engagement lasted seconds. The lesson lasted years. And yet this was not an isolated miracle or a lucky snapshot. It was part of a narrow window in 1965 and 1966, when assumptions on both sides were still fluid, when MiG pilots were still mapping the behavioral envelope of American aircraft, and when a machine built for loitering over jungle roads could momentarily rewrite the hierarchy of the sky. It entered service in 1946 and refused to die. It fought in Korea, then kept flying into a war no one had designed it for, because by 1965, both the Navy and the Air Force understood a hard truth. Nothing else could do what it did. The A-1E and A-1H variants carried different avionics, different cockpit layouts, but the same airframe, the same Radar 3350 radial engine, the same stubborn logic: fly low, carry everything, and stay until the job was finished or the tanks ran dry. Against every jet in theater, it was outclassed on paper. That part never changed. What changed was the mission. In South Vietnam and Thailand, Air Force crews used it for close air support and search and rescue. The rescue missions were obvious. A downed pilot on the ground needed someone overhead who would not leave in 90 minutes because the fuel gauge said so. Fast jets cycled off. The Skyraider orbited. It could sit over a survivor for hours, burn gas slowly, and turn jungle into a no-man's land with 20mm fire and rockets, while helicopters threaded their way in. Close air support required even more patience. An F-105 crossing the target at 500 knots had seconds, single digits, to see, decide, and release. The Skyraider at 250 had time to identify friend from enemy when the distance between them was 50 meters. Time to talk to an Army forward air controller whispering coordinates under fire. Time to correct. In a war of blurred front lines, time mattered more than speed. The Pentagon did not love that answer. The institutional vision favored supersonic interdiction, high-altitude bombing, clean diagrams drawn over jungle that did not behave cleanly. The Skyraider represented something uncomfortable. A slow, low aircraft circling at 5,000 feet, waiting for a radio call from a lieutenant in mud. It had advocates. Men who had flown it in Korea and understood that air support was proximity, not spectacle, but each year their voices were softer than the procurement budgets for F-4s and F-105s. Then came places like Ia Drang, where theory collided with contact. Jets could strike hard. They could not stay. The SPAD could stay. It would orbit, land, rearm, and come back. Soldiers did not care about Mach numbers. They cared about the sound of a radial engine that did not disappear. The Air Force lost 266 Skyraiders in Vietnam, mostly to ground fire, 2 to MiG-17s. Statistically, that was survivable compared to the F-105, which bled so heavily over the north that production barely kept pace. But survivability did not equal prestige. The future wore afterburners. The past wore a propeller. William A. Myers understood the contradiction intimately. Kansas-born, joined the Air Force in 1952, transports first, then fighters, then assigned to an aircraft many peers considered a career sidestep. By March 1966, he was on his second Southeast Asia tour, flying from Nakhon Phanom Royal Thai Air Base. Call sign SURF-41. Wife Patricia. 3 children. Letters home twice a week. Weather, food, homesickness. One February line his daughter later quoted, "It's the right airplane for this war even if nobody wants to admit it." It sounds polished in hindsight, but sometimes hindsight preserves what institutions try to erase. On March 20th, 1966, Myers launched on a search and rescue mission. Call sign Bango 2, an F-4 crew, had gone down in northeastern Laos after ground fire found them. Myers and his flight formed part of the RESCAP package, Rescue Combat Air Patrol. Orbit the survivors. Suppress anti-aircraft guns, coordinate the helicopters, stay until extraction or sunset. Doctrine was improvising in real time. Manuals had assumed friendly skies. Laos offered no such comfort, no front lines, heavy AAA, surface-to-air missiles, and MiG-17s willing to cross borders when it suited them. The briefing acknowledged the possibility. Enemy fighters in the area. Standard warning. Still, the loadout favored ground suppression, 20mm, rockets, perhaps bombs. The F-4S that were supposed to sit high and fast above the rescue stack were miles out of position, chasing a radar contact that dissolved into empty sky. Over the downed crew in Laos, there were no phantoms, no supersonic deterrent, Only Myers and his fellow Skyraider pilots circling at working altitude while two MiG-17s closed at roughly 450 knots. Myers had exactly zero formal air-to-air training in the A-1. The syllabus didn't include dogfighting because the aircraft wasn't built for it. SPAD drivers learned weapons delivery, forward air control coordination, low-level ingress and egress, how to talk to frightened men on the ground, and put ordnance 50 meters from friendly lines without killing them. Air combat belonged to F-4 and F-105 crews pushing north. Yet Myers had once flown F-86 Sabres, had once trained to think in terms of angles and closure and overshoot. That knowledge was years old and belonged to a different machine. The Skyraider could outturn an F-86 in a sustained circle, but in every other category, speed, climb, acceleration, it was inferior to any jet in theater. When the MiGs appeared from his 3 o'clock high, the choice presented itself in seconds. Break away and abandon the orbit, or turn into the threat and force geometry to work where thrust would not. Myers turned into them. Control inputs matter in moments like that. Stick left with authority, ailerons biting hard air, throttle pushed to maximum continuous power, rudder coordinated to keep the nose honest, hold the circle, and wait for the attacker's energy to erode. Theory says the faster aircraft overshoots if it commits too deeply. Reality says your own airspeed bleeds, altitude unwinds, and you gamble that the MiG pilot believes in his speed a fraction too long. Myers rolled left and tightened. The lead MiG did not overshoot spectacularly. No cinematic crossing at point-blank range, but he misjudged the circle enough. 500 feet of separation collapsed into a fleeting forward aspect. 3 seconds of opportunity. Myers pulled lead and fired a controlled burst at roughly 400 feet. 20mm high-explosive incendiary rounds do not negotiate with aluminum skin. They punch through, then let internal systems decide the outcome. Fuel tanks rupture. Hydraulic lines sever. Engines ingest fragments they cannot survive. Sometimes nothing critical is touched and the target flies on. This time something essential failed. The MiG rolled inverted and began a smoking descent. Myers reported impact approximately 6 miles northeast of the rescue site. He did not see an ejection. Decades later, declassified North Vietnamese records confirmed the loss in language stripped of names, aircraft destroyed by enemy action, passive voice, institutional distance. The second MiG disengaged almost immediately, breaking north without pressing another pass. That reaction aligns with doctrine. In 1966, the North Vietnamese Air Force possessed perhaps 60 operational MiG-17s. Preservation outweighed bravado. Losing a fighter to achieve nothing, especially against a propeller-driven attack aircraft, carried consequences far beyond one engagement. With the threat gone, Myers resumed the orbit. The rescue helicopters came in. The F-4 crew was extracted. Myers and his wingmen stayed overhead until the package crossed back toward Thailand. On paper, it was a standard RESCAP mission. In practice, it added another improbable entry to a short list of propeller aircraft downing jets in Vietnam. The Air Force documentation confirms the kill. Myers received the Silver Star. The citation compresses chaos into administrative prose: exceptional airmanship, aggressive spirit, destruction of an enemy MiG-17. Phrases that cannot fully describe the 3 seconds that mattered. He flew 47 more missions after March 20th. Finished his tour in September 1966, returned home, served stateside assignments. Retired in 1972 as a lieutenant colonel, died in Kansas in 2004. His obituary mentions service, family, woodworking, not the MiG. When Vietnamese authorities declassified the March 20th, 1966 loss report in 2012 and a translated copy circulated through U.S. analytical channels, one phrase stood out: unanticipated threat parameters. It appears 3 times in 2 pages. The document does not name Myers. It does not immediately identify the attacking aircraft as an A-1 Skyraiders. The opening paragraph describes the loss as occurring during combat operations against enemy rescue forces and attributes it to subsonic propeller-driven aircraft employing cannon armament. The wording feels engineered. Subsonic propeller-driven aircraft could mean almost anything. An anachronism, an oddity, a machine that should not logically dominate a jet. Only in paragraph 3 does the report specify American A-1 type attack aircraft. By then, the tone has shifted from surprise to technical diagnosis. Soviet advisors attached to the North Vietnamese Air Force did not treat the event as mystical. They recognized a pattern. In Korea, 1951, MiG-15 units had occasionally tangled with A-1 Skyraiders, same airframe under an earlier designation, and discovered the same trap. Speed advantage means nothing if it cannot be translated into a stable firing solution. Soviet tactical memoranda from that era contained explicit cautions. Do not engage slow attack aircraft in sustained turning fights. Dictate geometry with energy, or disengage. The guidance existed 15 years before Laos. It was simply discounted in 1966 because the Skyraider looked obsolete. A propeller in a jet war reads like vulnerability. The March 20 loss forced a quiet correction. Revised standing guidance for MiG-17 units emphasized avoidance unless both numerical superiority and altitude advantage were present, and even then prescribed single-pass attacks only. No prolonged maneuvering. The tactical assessment section reads less like narrative and more like an engineering worksheet. It lists Skyraider performance at combat speeds, compares sustained turn radius against MiG-17 characteristics, and concludes that the A-1's low-speed turning envelope produces engagement geometry unsuitable for standard intercept profiles. In plain language, our math fails in that circle. Another paragraph addresses training implications, recommending exposure to low-speed target engagement scenarios during MiG-17 conversion. Whether that recommendation was fully implemented is doubtful. Fuel was scarce. Airframes required constant maintenance. Training hours were finite. Preparing extensively to fight propeller aircraft likely seemed inefficient when most American threats were supersonic. The report closes by recommending prioritization of F-4 and F-105 interception over secondary threat aircraft, explicitly listing A-1, A-4, and helicopter types. Secondary threat. Not harmless. Simply inefficient to pursue. That categorization is revealing. Within 9 months, 2 MiG-17s had fallen to Skyraiders. The response was not emotional. It was mathematical. Avoid risk where payoff is minimal. Soviet advisors grasped something the American Air Force was still debating internally. Air combat outcomes emerge from interacting performance envelopes, not from brochure specifications. The Skyraiders' deficiency in speed produced cognitive distortion. MiG pilots expected American aircraft to fight like jets. Fast extensions, vertical maneuvers, energy tactics. The SPAD behaved like a late World War II fighter, tight horizontal turns, patience, forcing overshoot. That mismatch created fleeting but lethal windows. After mid-1966, engagement patterns shift. Not through a formal, published ban on contact with propeller aircraft, but through behavior. Mission reports show MiGs bypassing Skyraiders orbiting rescue sites. Loss statistics flatten. Intercepts concentrate on strike packages. Pilots learn to ignore the slow orbiting aircraft unless circumstances overwhelmingly favored attack. Korea had already supplied the precedent. On August 16, 1952, Lieutenant Commander George Duncan launched in an AD-4 Skyraider from USS Boxer and encountered a MiG-15 near Chinampo. He shot it down with 20mm cannon fire. The Navy did what institutions do: confirmed the claim, painted a star, archived the paperwork, continued the war. The event entered Navy memory, but not Navy mythology. A 1954 Naval Aviation News article gave it 3 restrained paragraphs, emphasizing ground attack versatility and mentioning the MiG almost in passing. No tactical dissection, no doctrinal rewrite, just proof that it had happened. The lesson existed, but it lived in a narrow corridor, carrier ready rooms, squadron debriefs, the oral chain between instructors and students. It did not migrate across service lines. The Air Force and Navy ran separate schools, separate doctrine shops, separate assumptions. What the Navy absorbed in Korea did not automatically transfer to Air Force A-1 units in Southeast Asia. Institutional knowledge does not move because it is printed. It moves because experienced pilots insist that it matters. By 1965, most Air Force Skyraider pilots had backgrounds in transports or trainers before transitioning to the SPAD. They mastered close air support, rescue procedures, weapons delivery. Air-to-air maneuvering against jets was not part of their expected world. So when Johnson in 1965 and Myers in 1966 turned into MiGs, they were not executing a preserved, systematized doctrine. They were rediscovering it. Turn radius over raw speed when the attacker commits inside your circle. The same geometry Duncan had exploited 13 years earlier, somewhere in Korean War after-action reports. One cited in a 1968 Air Force historical study as AAR 52-0847, there are likely dry summaries of similar encounters. Whether lost, misfiled, or simply forgotten, they did not shape training pipelines in time. Both Johnson and Myers entered their engagements without specific preparation for that scenario. Both relied on instinct, prior fighter experience in different aircraft, and the split-second miscalculation of a MiG pilot who believed speed guaranteed control. Both succeeded. Both repeated a lesson that should have been institutional, yet had become anecdotal. Some knowledge erodes not because it is false, but because it lacks a bureaucratic champion. Today, Bureau No. 5, 2-132646 rests in the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida. Under fluorescent lighting, the gray paint looks subdued, almost anonymous. Wingspan just under 50 feet, length about 38. Large for a single-seat aircraft, yet dwarfed by the jets around it. Museums compress perception. They make yesterday's workhorses seem smaller than their impact. The Skyraider appears exactly as it was, a 1944 design that outlived its era because utility outweighed fashion. Beneath the portside canopy rail, one red star remains, preserved during restoration rather than painted away. Curators could have stripped it for a cleaner finish. They did not. That small emblem anchors the airplane to a moment when assumptions failed. There are no twin stars on any surviving A-1, no dramatic gallery celebrating propeller planes defeating jets. Just isolated markings, scattered across history, tied to brief intersections of geometry and decision. The North Vietnamese revised their guidance after 1966. MiG units deprioritized Skyraiders, avoided sustained engagements, redirected effort toward faster American aircraft. The window closed. The SPAD returned to what it did best, orbiting, covering, enduring, until retirement in 1972 ended its official chapter. What remains is not a legend of dominance, but a study in interaction. How mismatched performance envelopes create unexpected vulnerabilities. How institutional memory can fracture between services. How a machine labeled obsolete can still dictate terms in a specific slice of sky. The Skyraider never won air superiority. It never redefined jet combat.